The rain came down in sheets that night, the kind that soaked through a jacket in 30 seconds and turned every streetlight into a smear of pale yellow against the dark. Baltimore in November had no patience for the unprepared. Renee Carter stood at the bus stop on Greenmount Avenue with her son pressed against her side, his small body tucked under her arm like she could shield him from the cold by sheer force of will. Jordan was 7 years old and weighed 53 pounds. The nurse had told her that, at his last appointment, in the same quiet voice she used to tell Renee everything. The voice that meant this is serious, and I need you to stay calm. He was small for his age. His lips, even now, held that faint bluish tint that Renee had learned to read the way other mothers read fevers, a thermometer she carried in her chest at all times. She pulled her jacket tighter around his shoulders. He didn't protest. He never did. He'll be okay, she told herself. The same 2 words she'd been telling herself for 3 years, since the first cardiologist visit, since the first time the word surgery appeared in a sentence next to her son's name. She just needed to figure out how to make that true. The phone call had come during her lunch break, 12 minutes she spent standing in the alley behind the restaurant, eating half a sandwich and checking her voicemail. The number was one she recognized. She'd been calling it for months. Miss Carter, this is Patricia from Haynes Medical Center's Financial Assistance Office. We've completed our review of your reapplication, and unfortunately, she didn't need to hear the rest. She'd heard it twice before. Unfortunately. Such a clean word for such a devastating thing. She stood there in the alley with the half-eaten sandwich in her hand, the smell of grease and dish soap drifting out from the kitchen vent, and let the word sit on her chest for exactly 30 seconds. That was the rule she'd made for herself. 30 seconds. Feel it. Then move. $83,000. That was the number. The surgery Jordan needed a full cardiac repair for the congenital defect he'd been born with. The one that had been manageable when he was small, but was no longer manageable, now cost $83,000 at Haynes Medical Center, the only facility within 200 miles with a pediatric cardiac team equipped to perform it. She had $412 in her checking account. Kendra put the sandwich in the trash, straightened her apron, and went back inside. She worked the afternoon shift without dropping a single plate. She picked Jordan up from her mother's house at 8:30, the way she did every night she worked the dinner rush. Diane Carter lived 12 minutes away by bus, in the small row house she'd bought 30 years ago with money saved from decades of cleaning other people's floors. The house was modest and warm, and smelled like the same lavender candles Diane had burned for as long as Renee could remember. Jordan was sitting at the kitchen table when Renee arrived, doing a puzzle with a focus that would have looked serious on a grown man. He looked up when she came in. "Hey, baby," she said. "Hey, Mom." He held up a puzzle piece. "This one doesn't fit anywhere. Save it for last. Sometimes the hard ones make more sense when everything else is in place." He considered this with the gravity of a philosopher, then set the piece aside. Renee stood in the doorway watching him, the way she always did when she first arrived, this private moment before she crossed the room and became mom again, the capable and reassuring version. She needed this moment. She needed to look at him and memorize him, the particular way his hair curled at his temples, the small scar on his chin from a fall 2 years ago, the way his shoulders sat just slightly too still, even when he was concentrating on something. Normal children fidgeted. Jordan conserved. His lips were tinged with that blue-purple shadow again, darker than yesterday. Her mother appeared at her shoulder, having come in from the living room so quietly that Renee startled. "Don't," Renee said, low, before Diane could speak. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." Diane was quiet for a moment. When Renee finally looked at her, she saw it immediately: her mother's eyes, red at the rims, the careful, controlled expression of a woman who had been holding something back for hours. "Mom," Renee said. "A warning." "I know," Diane said. "Not tonight." They stood together in silence, watching Jordan try to fit the difficult puzzle piece into a space it didn't belong. After a moment, almost to himself, he said, "I almost got it." "I know you did, baby," Diane said. Renee pulled her jacket back on. The bus was late. It was always late on rainy nights, and Renee had long since stopped being surprised by it. She stood at the stop on Greenmount, with Jordan beside her, his hand in hers, both of them watching the dark street for headlights. The rain had settled into something steadier now, not the violent sheets from earlier, but a cold, persistent drizzle that found every gap in a collar, every unguarded inch of skin. She had her jacket zipped to the chin and Jordan tucked against her left side, her arm around his shoulders. He was quiet in the way he got when he was tired, not the restless, fighting sleep quiet of most children, but a still, conserving quiet, like a phone running on low battery. She rubbed his arm through his coat sleeve. He leaned into her without looking up. That was when she noticed the man. He was sitting at the far end of the bench, the part without a roof overhang, which meant the rain was hitting him directly. He was old 70, maybe older, with white hair plastered flat against his head and a sport coat that had been expensive once but was doing nothing for him now. No umbrella, no hat. His shoulders moved in small, involuntary shudders, the kind a body produces when it has stopped asking permission to shiver. 3 other people stood at the stop. None of them looked at him. Renee looked at him for a long moment. She did the calculation that people in her position were always doing, the unconscious arithmetic of scarcity, the weighing of what she had against what someone else needed. She had $12 in her jacket pocket. She had half a tank of goodwill left after a 10-hour shift. She had Jordan against her side, his lips faintly blue, needing every degree of warmth she could provide. She had one jacket. She let go of Jordan's hand. "Stay right here," she told him. "Don't move." She crossed the 3 steps to the end of the bench, unzipped her jacket, and took it off. The cold hit her immediately, a sharp, full-body shock that she absorbed without flinching. She leaned forward and draped the jacket over the old man's shoulders, tucking it gently at the collar, the way she tucked Jordan's blanket at night. The man's shivering slowed. He turned to look at her. His eyes were gray and clear and startlingly alert for a man who'd been sitting in the rain. They moved from her face to her son's, and something in them shifted, not surprise exactly, but recognition of something, as if he were identifying a species he knew well but hadn't expected to encounter here. "You didn't have to do that," he said. His voice was steady, quiet. "It's cold," Renee said simply. He looked at Jordan again. The boy had stayed exactly where she'd told him to, watching with calm, dark eyes. "Is he all right?" the man asked. It was a specific question. Not "is everything okay," the way strangers usually asked. Not the reflexive social noise of someone filling silence. He was looking at Jordan the way a person looks at something they understand. "He will be," Renee said. The man nodded slowly, as if he accepted this, not as a deflection but as a statement of intent. He pulled the jacket tighter around his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it." The bus came 4 minutes later. Renee boarded with Jordan, found 2 seats near the back, and sat with her son pressed against her side, her arms wrapped around him, sharing what warmth she had left. She did not look back at the stop. She did not know the man's name. She did not think about him again that night. She had other things to think about. His name was Walter Haynes. He was 74 years old, and he had been walking alone in the rain, because that was what he did on nights when the silence in his house became too loud to sit with. Eleanor had been gone for 6 years, and the house they'd shared for 31 years had never recovered from her absence. Neither had he. So he walked. He had always been a walker. It was how he thought, how he processed, how he made decisions that would have paralyzed him at a desk. Tonight, the rain had caught him off guard, and he'd taken shelter at the bus stop while he waited for his driver to locate him. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes before the woman came. He watched the bus pull away from the stop, red taillights bleeding in the wet street, and he sat for a moment, in the jacket that smelled faintly of coffee and something floral, cheap soap, maybe, or a dollar store lotion. A working woman's smell. He knew it well. His mother had smelled like that. His driver Thomas arrived 8 minutes later. In the car, warm and dry, Walter sat in the back seat and said nothing for several blocks. Then, "Thomas, I need you to do something for me." Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror. "Sir?" The woman at that bus stop. She had a young boy with her. The boy had. He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had spent decades in medicine. He had visible signs of central cyanosis, blue tint to the lips, low energy. Small for his age. He looked out the window. "I want to know who she is." Thomas was quiet for a moment. You want me to find a stranger from a bus stop, sir? I want you to try. She was young, late 20s. The boy had a hospital bracelet on his right wrist. I noticed it when she crossed in front of the bench. Check Haynes Medical's pending and rejected financial assistance files. Start with pediatric cardiac cases. Cross-reference any single-parent households. The bracelet will have a patient ID. Thomas didn't ask why. In 20 years of working for Walter Haynes, he had learned that the man's instincts were worth following without explanation. The answer came the next morning. Walter was at his desk by 6 a.m., the way he always was, when Thomas set a single printed page in front of him, a patient file, pediatric, cardiac, Jordan James Carter, age 7. Diagnosis: complex congenital heart defect requiring surgical repair. Estimated procedure cost: $83,000. Financial assistance application status: denied. Third submission. Walter read it twice. Then he read the mother's name, Renee Carter, 28. 2 jobs, no cosigner, no savings, no living father listed on the form. He set the paper down on his desk and looked at the photograph of his mother on the shelf across the room. Ruth Haynes, in her church clothes, smiling the way she smiled when she thought no one was looking. She had died of a cardiac event at 61, a condition that, by that point in medical history, was entirely treatable. The reason it went untreated was the same reason it always went untreated. She couldn't afford the treatment. Walter had built Haynes Medical Center in her name. He had said, at the ribbon-cutting ceremony 30 years ago, that no one in this city would die of poverty again if he had anything to do with it. He sat very still at his desk for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called his son. Renee had 2 days off that month. She used both of them on Haynes Medical Center. She dressed carefully on the first morning, not to impress anyone, but because she had learned, through years of navigating offices and waiting rooms and bureaucratic hallways, that people treated you differently depending on how you looked. She wore the dark slacks she saved for job interviews and the gray blouse Diane had given her 2 Christmases ago. She fixed Jordan's hair, dropped him at her mother's house by 8, and was at the hospital's main entrance by 8:45. The financial assistance office was on the 3rd floor, past the cardiac wing, past a wall of donor plaques, and framed photographs of hospital milestones. She walked with her folder under her arm, 3 copies of everything, because she'd learned that lesson the hard way and found the right door at the end of a corridor that smelled like disinfectant and recycled air. The woman at the front desk looked up briefly. Do you have an appointment? No, Renee said, but I've submitted 3 applications and I'd really like to speak to someone in person about my son's case. You need an appointment to meet with a case manager. How do I make an appointment? You can call the main line or submit a request through the patient portal. I've called the main line 11 times. I've submitted 2 portal requests. No one has responded. The woman's expression did not change. I'm sorry about that. I can leave a note for one of the managers. Can I speak to a manager directly? They're in a staff meeting until 10:30. I can wait. It might be after lunch before anyone's available. I can wait, Renee said again. She sat down in one of the plastic chairs along the wall. She opened her folder and reviewed her documents for the 4th time, not because she needed to, but because it gave her hands something to do. Around her, the office moved at the pace of an institution that had learned to process urgency into paperwork. Phones rang and were answered in the same flat tone. Forms were stamped and filed. Names were called and not called. At 10:53, a man in a lanyard came out of the back hallway, glanced at the waiting area, and asked the front desk something in a low voice. The woman at the desk pointed at Renee. The man approached. Miss Carter? Yes. I'm Kevin Shaw, Assistant Patient Services Coordinator. I understand you'd like to discuss a financial assistance case. My son's case. Jordan Carter, 7 years old, pediatric cardiac. 3rd application, most recently denied 2 weeks ago. He nodded slowly. I can pull up the file, but I want to be upfront with you. Our review process is thorough, and if the applications have been denied, there are typically substantive reasons based on our eligibility criteria. I understand that, Renee said. I'd like to understand what those reasons are specifically, and whether there's any alternative pathway, a payment plan, a partial grant, a charity care provision, Anything. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. The look of someone who was genuinely not unsympathetic, but who existed inside a system that had long ago made his sympathy irrelevant. "Let me pull the file," he said. He came back 20 minutes later with a printout and a careful expression. He walked her through the denial income-to-debt ratio, lack of qualifying insurance tier, insufficient documentation of hardship. She listened to every word. She asked 3 specific follow-up questions. She did not raise her voice. He could not offer her anything new. She took her folder, thanked him by name, and left. In the elevator on the way down, she stood very straight and looked at the floor numbers changing, and did not let herself think too hard about anything until she was outside, around the corner, out of sight of the entrance. Then she stopped walking and stood against the brick wall of the hospital's east side and pressed her back into it and looked up at the gray November sky. 3 weeks, the doctor had told her at Jordan's last appointment his condition had worsened faster than anticipated, and the window that had once been 60 days was now 21, not 3 months. 3 weeks. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. She had a list there: 23 names, charities and foundations, church programs, and government assistance lines. She scrolled through them now, the ones marked with a small X next to them, the ones still unmarked. 11 X's, 12 left. She put her phone away, pushed off the wall, and walked to the bus stop. Over the next 12 days, the remaining 12 became 12 X's. 6 organizations told her she didn't meet their eligibility criteria. 3 told her she did, but their next review cycle was in 8 to 12 weeks. 2 said they'd follow up and didn't. 1, a small children's health foundation she'd found through a church bulletin, told her they could contribute up to $2,000 toward documented medical expenses. $2,000. She said thank you and meant it, and cried in the parking lot of the Walgreens where she'd taken the call. Jordan was admitted to the emergency room on a Thursday evening, 12 days after Renee's visit to the hospital. His heart had gone into an arrhythmic episode during dinner, not the first time, but the worst so far. He was stable by the time the ambulance arrived and was discharged the following morning with a new medication adjustment and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the next week. The ER attending, Dr. Pearson, sat with Renee in the consultation room at 11 p.m. and said, as gently as she could, "The episodes are going to get more frequent. His heart is working too hard to compensate for what it can't do on its own. The repair needs to happen in the next 3 weeks from his original assessment. You're now inside that window." After that, she stopped, started again. "The window closes." Renee nodded. "I understand. Is there anything?" "I'm working on it," Renee said. "Thank you." She sat with Jordan until he fell asleep, his small chest rising and falling under the hospital blanket, the monitor beside him, tracing his heartbeat in green light. She watched that line, its peaks and valleys, its stubborn continuity, and did not allow herself to think about what it would look like if it flattened. He will be okay, she thought. Figure out how. Walter Drummond arrived at his office at 6 a.m. the morning after he received the report from Thomas, and sat at his desk with Jordan's file open in front of him. The medical facts were straightforward. The boy's condition was serious but surgically correctable. Haynes Medical had one of the best pediatric cardiac teams on the East Coast. In different circumstances, this would be a complex but manageable case. The financial facts were equally straightforward and equally damning. Walter leaned back in his chair and looked at the photograph on the shelf. Ruth Haynes, née Coleman, born 1,931 inches East Baltimore, died 1,989. She had worked as a building custodian for 26 years. She had raised Walter alone after his father left, on a salary that never exceeded $22,000 a year. She had given him everything she had, which was never money, but was always enough. She had started having chest pains in the spring of 1988. She'd ignored them for 3 months because she couldn't afford to stop ignoring them. By the time she went to the doctor, the damage was significant. The surgery that might have helped her cost $80,000 adjusted for inflation, almost exactly what Jordan Carter needed now. She had died 11 months later, at 61, of a second cardiac event, in the kitchen of the apartment she'd lived in for 20 years. Walter had been 39. He had already made his first $1 million. He had not been able to save her, because he had not known, because she had not told him, because Ruth Haynes did not ask for help. She carried things alone until she couldn't carry them anymore. He had built this hospital because of her. He had meant it. He looked at the file again. Third application denied. He thought about a woman standing at a bus stop in the rain, taking off her only jacket for a stranger, saying he will be with the certainty of someone who refused to consider the alternative. He thought about his mother saying, "I'm fine for 11 months. He picked up the phone and called his son. Marcus Haynes's office was on the 6th floor, corner suite, with a view of the inner harbor. He was 44 years old and had spent the better part of those years stepping out of a very long shadow. Walter Haynes was not a difficult man to love, but he was a difficult man to follow, the kind of father whose approval arrived in the form of raised expectations rather than praise. Marcus had solved every problem his father gave him. He had taken a hospital that ran on its founder's reputation and idealism and turned it into an institution with a bond rating, a capital reserve, and a national ranking in pediatric cardiac care. He had done this by being clear-eyed about what a hospital actually was. Not a charity, not a monument to someone's grief, but a complex organization that required financial discipline to survive. You could not help anyone if you went bankrupt. He had told his father this many times. Walter arrived at 10:15 and sat down across from Marcus's desk with the look of a man who had been thinking carefully for several days. "There's a case I want to discuss," he said. Marcus nodded. Thomas called ahead. "Jordan Carter. You know it." "I know it, because I reviewed it personally when your driver started making inquiries through our records department." His voice was even. "Third-party requests for patient file reviews are a compliance issue, Dad. I let it go because it was you, but I want to be clear that it wasn't appropriate." "Noted," Walter said. "Tell me about the denials." Marcus opened the file on his desk. "The family doesn't meet our charity care threshold. Single-income household, but the income level puts them just above the automatic qualification cutoff. The hardship documentation wasn't sufficient for the discretionary review board to override. Standard process. The boy is going to die if he doesn't have surgery in the next 2 weeks. Approximately 47 other children in comparable situations are waiting on this system right now, Dad. If we override the process for one case, I know the argument. Then we open the door to overriding it for any case where someone makes a compelling personal appeal. Where does it stop? Who decides which stories are compelling enough?" Marcus set the file down. "I understand this feels different because of how you encountered it, but the process exists precisely so that decisions aren't made based on which patient's mother happened to be at the right bus stop at the right time." Walter looked at him for a long moment. "You've been waiting to make that argument. I've been making it for 8 years. You just haven't needed to hear it until now." The room was quiet. Outside, the harbor was a flat gray sheet under the overcast sky. Marcus reached into his desk drawer and placed a thick folder on the surface between them. 47 files, he said. "Pending discretionary review, pediatric cases only, all with documented medical urgency. They've been waiting an average of 9 weeks. If I approve Jordan Carter today, what do I tell the families of these 47 children?" Walter looked at the folder. He did not reach for it. "You tell them," he said slowly, "that you're fixing the system that made all 48 of them wait this long." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's not a real answer. It's the only real answer there is." Walter stood. "I'm not asking you to break the process, Marcus. I'm asking you to look at what the process is producing and decide if that's what you want your name on." He left without waiting for a response. Marcus sat alone in his corner office for a long time after his father left. He pulled the folder of 47 files toward him and opened it. He read the first file, then the second, then the third. Each one had a name, an age, a diagnosis, a dollar amount, a status, denied, pending, under review. Each one was a child. Each one had a mother somewhere who was making calls and sitting in waiting room chairs and saying he will be okay to herself in the dark. He closed the folder, opened his laptop, began to type. Diane Carter called her daughter on a Sunday afternoon, 2 days after Jordan's ER discharge. "Come over for dinner," she said. "I made your soup." Renee knew it wasn't about the soup. She came anyway. because the soup was real, and she was tired, and sometimes real things were the only things that helped. They ate together at the kitchen table, the three of them, Renee, Diane, and Jordan, who ate half a bowl and fell asleep on the couch before 7. Renee covered him with the blue blanket from the closet and stood watching him sleep for a moment, the monitor app on her phone tracking his pulse the way she'd taken to doing since the ER visit. Steady. Okay. She came back to the kitchen. Diane was washing the bowls. Mom, sit down first. Mom, whatever you're going to say. Sit down, Renee. She sat. Diane dried her hands, turned around, and leaned against the counter. Then she walked to the small secretary desk in the corner of the kitchen and opened the top drawer. She placed a document on the table. Renee looked at it without touching it. A property assessment. The house. She knew the number before she saw it. $92,000, give or take, in this market. I've already talked to a real estate agent, Diane said. Informal conversation, nothing signed. She thinks it could sell in 3 weeks if we price it right. No, Renee said. It's enough for the surgery and a little extra. You and Jordan can stay here while the house is listed. After the sale, we find somewhere smaller. I don't need all this space anyway. I never did. Mom, this is your house. You worked 30 years for this house. And you are my daughter, Diane said, with a quiet finality that stopped the conversation cold. And that is my grandson asleep on that couch. There is no version of this where I watch that boy, her voice caught. She pressed her lips together and waited a moment. There is no version of this where I keep a house. Renee looked at the document on the table. The paper was slightly worn at the fold. Diane had been carrying it in her pocket, probably for days. You've been sitting on this, Renee said. I was waiting until you ran out of other options. I haven't. Renee, Diane said it simply, without accusation, without pity. Have you? The kitchen was very quiet. Renee sat with that question and felt the full weight of it. The 23 calls, the 3 applications, the $412, the $2,000 from the foundation, the look on Kevin Shaw's face when he told her there was nothing more he could do. The weight of it pressed down through her shoulders and into the chair beneath her. Give me a few more days, she said at last. Okay. Don't call the agent yet. Okay. Renee stood slowly, pressed her palms against the table, and breathed. She walked to the couch and sat beside her sleeping son, resting her hand lightly on his back. She felt his breath, the rise and fall of it, the stubborn, ordinary miracle of it, and she stayed there in the dark until the feeling in her chest settled from panic into something quieter and more determined. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from the hospital's automated patient notification system. Jordan's status had been flagged for urgent care coordination. A nurse from the pediatric cardiac unit would be calling in the morning to discuss immediate admission. Renee read it 3 times. Immediate admission. Not scheduled, not pending. Immediate. She didn't know what had changed. She didn't know who had made a call, or signed a form, or walked into whose office. She knew only that the days she'd asked for had arrived as something else entirely, as action, as movement, as a door opening where there had been only wall. She set the phone face down on the table and sat in the dark with her hand on her son's back and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not quite hope and not quite relief, but was located somewhere near both of them. Figure out how, she had told herself. Someone had. At the same hour, across the city, Marcus Haynes sat at his desk and sent 3 text messages to his father. The first, Jordan Carter case approved for immediate surgical review. Fast-tracking financial assistance override under emergency hardship provision. Also, pulling the other 47 files for expedited review. The second, a few minutes later, this doesn't fix the system, Dad. We need to talk about that. The third, sent at 11:30 p.m. I'm going to scrub in on the Carter surgery myself. Walter read that last message twice. His son had not stood at a surgical table in 4 years, not since he'd moved fully into administration. But Marcus had been a surgeon before he was a CEO. He had gone to medical school because his grandmother died young and he'd needed to understand why. Those reasons did not expire. Walter typed back, "Thank you." He looked out the window at the city, the wet streets, the yellow lights, the bus stops and corner stores and row houses of East Baltimore, the part of the city that had made him and that he had spent his life trying to repay. He thought about a woman at a bus stop in the rain, a jacket placed on his shoulders without ceremony or expectation. It's cold. As simple as that. He thought about his mother. He will be okay, the woman had said. Walter put his phone in his pocket and thought, yes, he will. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. Renee arrived at the hospital at 5:30 because she could not sleep and because sitting in her mother's living room in the dark had become unbearable somewhere around 4 a.m. She signed the consent forms at the admissions desk with a steady hand and a pen that ran out of ink halfway through her signature, and the intake nurse gave her a new one without comment, and Renee finished signing, and that was that. They let her stay with Jordan in the pre-op room until 6:50. He was in the small hospital gown with the blue pattern, the one that was too big for him, the way everything in hospitals was too big for children, and he had the IV line in his left arm and the pulse oximeter clipped to his finger, and he was looking at the ceiling with the thoughtful expression he got when he was working something out. "Does it hurt?" Renee asked, nodding at the IV. "A little, not a lot." He turned his head to look at her. "Are you scared?" "No," she said. He looked at her with 7-year-old precision. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The face where you're scared, but you're not going to say so because you don't want me to be scared." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled her chair closer to the bed and leaned her arms on the railing and looked at him directly, eye to eye, the way she did when she meant every word. "A little," she said, "but I'm also sure." "You know what the difference is between scared and sure?" He shook his head. "Scared is about what might happen. Sure is about what you know. I'm scared about what I can't control, but I'm sure about you." She put her hand over his, careful of the IV line. "I have always been sure about you, Jordan." He thought about this seriously. Then he said, "I'm a little scared too. That's okay, but I'm also a little sure." "Yeah? I'm sure you'll be here when I wake up." She had to look away for a moment. Out the small window, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges, that particular gray-blue of early morning, the hour that belonged to neither night nor day. "I will be right outside that door," she said. The whole time. At 6:50, the nurse came in to begin the pre-op protocol, and Renee kissed her son's forehead and stood up and walked out of the room because there was nothing else to do, and staying would only make it harder for both of them. She heard him say, just before the door closed, "Bye, Mom. Bye, baby." The waiting room outside the surgical suites was a small, institutional space, chairs along the walls, a television mounted in the corner with the volume turned low, a table with old magazines, and a box of tissues that someone had the foresight to keep stocked. Renee sat in the chair closest to the door that led to the OR corridor. She had her phone, her folder, and a cup of coffee she'd gotten from the vending machine and hadn't drunk. At 7:12, she looked up and saw Walter Haynes walking down the corridor toward her. She recognized him immediately. She'd learned his name from the admissions coordinator who had called to schedule the surgery, had put the pieces together with a quiet shock of recognition that had kept her awake for a stretch of the night. The man in the rain, the jacket, the gray eyes that had looked at Jordan with the attention of someone who understood what they were seeing. He sat down 2 chairs away from her, leaving a respectful space, and set his hands on his knees. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. They sat in silence. The television in the corner showed an early morning news program, muted, the anchors talking at each other with expressions of practiced concern. "The surgeon," Renee said. "They told me his name is Dr. Marcus Haynes." "My son," Walter said. She absorbed this. "He's good?" "He's the best I've ever seen," Walter said. And there was something in the way he said it, simple and direct, without qualification, that settled something in her chest. Not a father's pride, or not only that, the assessment of someone who had spent 50 years watching surgeons work. He hasn't stood at a table in a while. But some things don't leave you. Renee nodded. She picked up the coffee cup, held it without drinking. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why were you walking alone in the rain?" He was quiet for a moment. "My wife died 6 years ago. The house gets loud when it's empty. Walking helps." He paused. "She would have liked you." Renee didn't know what to say to that. so she said nothing, and it seemed like the right response. After a moment, Walter spoke again. "I built this hospital because of my mother," he said. "She died of a heart condition she couldn't afford to treat. I was almost 40 years old and I had money, and I didn't know she was sick because she didn't tell me. She carried everything alone." He looked at his hands. "I said this hospital would be different, that no one would die of poverty here." He was quiet for a moment. I stopped paying attention to whether that was still true. Renee listened. "You gave me your jacket in the rain," he said. "You had nothing to spare and you gave it anyway. And I sat in the back of a warm car thinking about a woman who had nothing and still found something to give." He looked at her. "I remembered who I was supposed to be." Renee was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My son is going to be okay." It was not a question. It was not entirely for him. But Walter nodded, as if she'd said something he also believed. At 8:41, the monitors inside OR-3 alarmed. Jordan's heart rate, which had been holding at the target range through the first 90 minutes of the procedure, dropped sharply 22 beats per minute in 11 seconds, a cascade that pulled every person in the room into immediate, focused motion. The perfusionist called the numbers. The scrub nurse moved. The anesthesiologist made 2 adjustments in rapid succession. Marcus stood at the table and looked at the field and did not move for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was not a long time. In 4 seconds, a person could take 2 breaths, read a single sentence, cross a small room. In 4 seconds in an operating room, with a 7-year-old's heart under your hands, it was long enough for doubt to arrive and be evaluated and dismissed. He had done this before. Not this exact procedure, not this exact heart, but this moment, the moment where the variables shifted, and the textbook answer wasn't sufficient, and the only resource available was judgment, trained over 20 years of standing at tables like this one. He made the adjustment, spoke 2 instructions, clearly, without urgency in his voice, because urgency was contagious, and a calm room was a better room. His hands were steady. He had always had steady hands. It was the thing his father had noticed first, years ago, watching him work. The numbers climbed back. 40 beats, 60, 78. The room exhaled as a single organism. "Good," Marcus said. "Let's keep going." Renee heard nothing of this. She sat in the waiting room chair with her hands folded in her lap and watched the door and did not allow herself to construct scenarios. She had learned, over years of managing things alone, that the imagination was the enemy of endurance, that the mind's ability to generate worst cases was not a survival tool but a drain, and that the only protection against it was to stay inside the present moment. What was actually happening? She was sitting in a chair. The chair was hard. The coffee was cold. Walter Haynes was beside her, reading something on his phone with his glasses on, occasionally lowering it to look at the door the same way she was looking at it. At 9:55, the door opened. A nurse came out, a young man with a calm face, who looked at Renee as he crossed the room, which she took as a good sign, because in her experience, people did not meet your eyes when they were delivering bad news. "Miss Carter, the procedure is complete. Your son is in recovery. Dr. Haynes will be out to speak with you in a few minutes, but I wanted to let you know right away Jordan did very well." Renee heard the words. She processed them one at a time. The way you processed something you had been waiting so long to hear, that the actual hearing of it felt almost unreal. "The procedure is complete. Jordan did very well. Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. The nurse nodded and went back through the door. Renee sat for another moment. Then she put her face in her hands, not to cry, or not only to cry but to have somewhere to put the feeling, which was too large for her face to hold all at once. It moved through her like a wave, the relief and the exhaustion and the gratitude and the months of carrying this alone, all of it finding the exit at the same time. Walter did not say anything. He did not offer a tissue or fill the silence with words. He simply sat beside her and let her have it, which was exactly right. After a minute, she lifted her face, pressed her fingers under her eyes, straightened. "Okay," she said, mostly to herself. They let her into the recovery room at 10:40. Jordan was small against the white pillow, the monitors still attached, the IV still running. But the first thing she saw, the very first thing, before she registered anything else about the room was his lips. Pink. Fully, unmistakably, pink. She had forgotten, in 7 years of loving the blue-tinged version, what his lips were supposed to look like. She stood in the doorway and looked at the color of them and felt something shift in her chest. A recalibration, a before and after, a line drawn clearly between what had been and what would be now. She crossed the room and sat beside him. He was drowsy from the anesthesia, his eyes half open, blinking slowly. "Mom," he said. His voice was small and hoarse and the best thing she had ever heard. "I'm here," she said. He turned his head to look at her, moving his eyes over her face with the careful attention he gave to puzzles. "You were there the whole time," he said. It was not a question. "The whole time," she said. He seemed satisfied. He closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell steadily, evenly, the heart inside it doing now what it was always supposed to do. Renee put her hand over his and stayed. Marcus found her in the family consultation room an hour later, still in his surgical cap, the mask pulled down around his chin. He sat across from her and walked her through the procedure in plain language, what they'd done, what had gone briefly wrong, and how they'd corrected it, what the recovery would look like. He spoke to her without condescension, without the glaze of professional distance that so often passed for competence. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for doing it yourself." He looked at his hands for a moment, the steady hands, the ones that had always been the truest thing about him. "I should have been doing it all along," he said. It was not clear whether he meant this surgery specifically or something larger, perhaps both. 3 months later, Haynes Medical Center announced the establishment of the Ruth and Jordan Fund, a dedicated program providing emergency surgical care for children under 12 from households below 200% of the federal poverty line, fully funded through a combination of hospital reserves and a private endowment established by Walter Haynes personally. The fund was named, Walter explained at the small press event held in the hospital's atrium, for 2 people, the mother he had lost, and the boy who had reminded him why he'd built this place to begin with. Marcus signed the founding documents as CEO. He had also, in the preceding 3 months, initiated a full review of the hospital's financial assistance protocols, a process that was ongoing, unglamorous, and necessary. He did not announce this publicly. He simply did it. Renee was offered a position as Patient Advocacy Coordinator, a new role created within the Social Services Department. The offer was not framed as charity. It was framed correctly as the hiring of someone whose specific experience navigating the gap between what the hospital promised and what it delivered was a professional qualification, not just a personal history. She accepted. On a Wednesday morning in late February, Renee stood at the window of her new office on the 2nd floor, a small room with a desk and a plant she was already worried about overwatering, and watched the small courtyard below. Jordan was down there with Diane, who had brought him for a follow-up appointment and arrived 40 minutes early so he could spend time outside. He was running, not the careful, conserving movement of a child managing his body's limitations, but running the way children were supposed to run without calculation, without cost, with the pure expenditure of energy that was the body's way of saying, "I have enough. I have more than enough. I have some to spare." Diane sat on a bench and watched him with her hands folded in her lap and an expression that Renee, from 2 floors up, could not fully read but recognized. It was the expression of someone who had been prepared for less and received more. The expression of reprieve. Renee watched until Jordan looped back to his grandmother, said something that made her laugh, and then turned and looked up at the building, scanning the windows with the instinct children had for locating their mothers. He found her. He raised one hand and waved, large and unself-conscious, the wave of someone who had nothing to conserve. She raised her hand and waved back. Outside, the Baltimore sky was the particular pale blue of late winter giving way to something warmer. Not spring yet, but closer. "He's okay," she thought. And this time, it wasn't the 2 words she said to keep going. It was just the truth.